Alarms do not sound the way you expect them to. They do not scream. They hum, low and steady, like something patient waiting for you to notice it. I noticed it the moment 300 human ships lifted off from every Concord shipyard at once, without warning, without a single request for clearance. I was standing in the observation deck of Halvorn Station when it happened. One moment the docking bay held rows of human transport vessels, quiet and ordinary, the kind of ships nobody bothered to look at twice anymore. The next moment, every single one of them ignited their engines in perfect unison and pulled away from the station like a tide pulling back from the shore. I did not understand what I was watching. None of us did. My aide, a small nervous being named Torv, tugged at my sleeve and asked if this was a drill. I told him it was not, though I had no idea what it actually was. I only knew that something enormous had just shifted, and none of us had been given the courtesy of a warning. It had started 3 days earlier, in a chamber far less dramatic than this one. The Concord Council had gathered to review a diplomatic simulation exercise, a routine test meant to measure trust between member species. The human delegation had performed well, perhaps too well. They had solved a hostage negotiation scenario in under 4 minutes, using something one counselor called instinct rather than proper procedure. Instinct was treated like a dirty word in that room. I remember the debate clearly. Counselor Aschenmeyer stood and declared that humans had cheated, that their reliance on gut feeling instead of calculated protocol proved they could not be trusted with real diplomatic weight. Nobody asked how a species with instinct alone had also built fleets, cured diseases, and kept half the Concord's border worlds fed. Nobody asked because nobody wanted to. The vote passed with an uncomfortable majority. Humanity's status was downgraded from full partner to provisional observer, a polite way of saying they no longer had a seat at the table that mattered. I watched the human ambassador, a woman named Grace Holloway, listen to the verdict without a flicker of anger crossing her face. She simply folded her hands, thanked the council for its time, and said one sentence that I did not think much of at the moment. She said, "We understand, and we will act accordingly." Then she stood, gathered her small stack of notes, and left the chamber without another word. I assumed accordingly meant humans would grumble, file a formal complaint, and continue business as usual, the way every other species did when the council trimmed their influence. I was wrong in a way that would take me weeks to fully grasp. Now, standing on Halvorn Station watching human ships vanish into the black, I finally understood what accordingly had meant. It meant leaving, not just from the chamber, not just from the vote, but from everything, every supply route, every maintenance contract, every quiet favor that nobody had bothered to thank them for. Torv asked me again what was happening, his voice small and shaking. I told him to contact Fleet Command and ask for an explanation, though some part of me already suspected there would be no explanation waiting for us. Humans did not tend to repeat themselves once they had already told you clearly what they intended to do. Within an hour, the station's internal communications system began flooding with requests from a dozen sectors. Colony administrators wanted to know why their scheduled supply convoys had not launched. Shipyard managers wanted to know why half their engineering staff had failed to report for duty. Nobody yet understood that these were not isolated failures. They were the first ripples of something much larger. I made my way down to the command deck, where Director Alson Voro was pacing in front of a wall of failing status reports. He looked at me the way a drowning man looks at another swimmer, hoping I might somehow have an answer he did not. I had nothing to offer him except the memory of a calm woman folding her hands and saying a single sentence that none of us had taken seriously enough. Alson asked if I thought this was temporary, a protest that would fade once tempers cooled. I wanted to believe that too. It would have been easier. But something about the precision of the withdrawal, the way every human ship had departed at the exact same moment across dozens of systems, told me this had been planned long before the vote ever happened. They had not reacted in anger. They had simply been waiting to see what we would choose. Reports kept arriving faster than we could read them. A mining colony on the edge of Concord space reported that its human-run life support technicians had left without so much as a note. A hospital station reported that 3 of its 5 surgical teams, all human, had resigned within the same hour and boarded a departing transport before anyone could ask them to reconsider. I remember feeling a strange, sinking sensation in my chest, the kind you feel when you realize a structure you assumed was solid was actually held together by a single support beam you never noticed. We had spent cycles telling ourselves that humans were useful but replaceable, competent but not essential. We were about to discover exactly how wrong that belief had been. Alson asked me to draft an emergency message to the human government, something that might convince them to pause, to talk, to give the council a chance to reconsider its decision. I sat down to write it, but the words would not come easily. What could we possibly say that would undo a vote we had already cast so carelessly? While I struggled over the message, a new alert appeared on the main display. A supply convoy bound for the outer agricultural worlds had failed to depart from its scheduled route. That convoy fed nearly 2 million people across 4 different systems. It had been operated almost entirely by a small, dedicated group of human logistics officers who had quietly kept the route running for years without complaint or recognition. I asked Alson who would take over the route now that the humans were gone. He looked at me with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. He admitted that he did not know. Nobody else in the Concord had ever bothered to learn the route in enough detail to run it themselves, because it had simply always worked, quietly, reliably, in the background, thanks to people we had never thought to properly value. I finished the emergency message an hour later and sent it through every diplomatic channel we had access to. I did not know yet whether anyone on the other end would even read it. I only knew that somewhere far from that station, on a planet none of us had visited enough or respected enough, a decision had already been made, and it was not going to be reversed simply because we suddenly needed them again. Outside the viewport, the last human transport cleared the edge of Halvorn Station's defensive perimeter and vanished into a jump point without ceremony, without farewell, and without a single glance back. I stood there long after it disappeared, watching the empty stretch of space where it had been, and for the first time in my long career on the council, I felt genuinely afraid of what tomorrow would bring. The first week after the departure felt like watching a slow crack spread across a pane of glass. Nothing shattered all at once. Instead, small failures appeared one after another, each one seeming minor on its own, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. I spent most of those days buried in status reports from sectors I had rarely thought about before. The names of colonies I could barely pronounce started appearing in my briefings again and again, each one reporting the same kind of trouble. Power grids running unstable, water reclamation systems throwing errors nobody could diagnose, medical supply shipments arriving late, or not arriving at all. Director Alson Voro called an emergency briefing on the 4th day, gathering department heads from every major division of the Concord's logistics network. I sat near the back of the room, watching engineers and administrators shuffle papers and avoid eye contact with one another, each of them clearly hoping someone else would have the answers they did not. A young engineer named Priya Ashworth stood to give the first real report of the day. She managed the coolant systems for 3 orbital stations near the edge of Concord territory, systems that had been quietly maintained by a rotating team of human technicians for as long as she had worked there. She told us, in a voice that kept threatening to crack, that 2 of her 3 stations had reported critical coolant failures within 72 hours of the human departure. She explained that the human technicians had never simply followed a manual. They had built their own shortcuts, their own small fixes, patched into the original systems so seamlessly that nobody else had realized how much of the infrastructure depended on knowledge that existed only in those technicians' heads. When they left, they took decades of quiet, unrecorded expertise with them, and nobody else knew where to even begin looking for the problems they used to solve without a second thought. I remember the silence that followed her report. It was not the silence of people processing bad news calmly. It was the silence of people beginning to understand, for the first time, the true size of the mistake the council had made. Alison asked if backup documentation existed anywhere. Priya shook her head and admitted that requests for proper documentation had been submitted for years, but funding for that kind of administrative work had always been redirected toward projects the council considered more important. Nobody had ever thought it urgent enough to insist upon, because the systems always simply worked. After the briefing ended, I took a personal transport out to one of the failing stations myself, hoping that seeing the problem directly might help me understand what we were truly facing. The station, called Faro Relay, orbited a mining colony that supplied rare minerals to nearly a dozen shipbuilding operations across conquered space. When I arrived, the corridors were dimmer than they should have been, lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows across walls lined with warning notices. A station supervisor named Callum Reeve met me at the docking bay, his uniform wrinkled, his eyes carrying the exhausted look of someone who had not slept properly in days. Callum walked me through the station, pointing out sections that had already been sealed off due to failing environmental controls. He told me that before the departure, a single human technician named Nathan Cole had managed nearly the entire life support network almost single-handedly, quietly rotating through maintenance checks that the rest of the staff had never fully understood. I asked Callum if anyone had tried contacting Nathan directly, hoping perhaps a personal appeal might convince him to return, even temporarily, to help stabilize the systems. Callum told me that a message had been sent, and a response had come back within hours, polite but firm. Nathan explained that he had already accepted a position back on Earth, working alongside colleagues he had known for years, in a system that valued the kind of quiet expertise the Concorde had always taken for granted. Standing in that dim corridor, surrounded by the low hum of failing machinery, I finally began to understand something I had been avoiding for days. We had not lost a workforce. We had lost an entire invisible foundation that the rest of us had built our comfort upon without ever bothering to properly acknowledge it. The failures did not stop at Faro Relay. Over the following days, reports arrived from agricultural worlds where irrigation systems, long maintained by small teams of human volunteers working through exchange programs, began to fail in ways local administrators could not repair. Farmers who had relied on those systems for generations now faced the very real possibility of failed harvests within a single growing season. I remember a call from a colony administrator named Grace Whitfield, no relation to the ambassador who had delivered the fateful sentence that started all of this. Grace ran a farming settlement on the edge of Concorde space, home to nearly 40,000 people. She told me, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, that her settlement's water purification system had begun failing intermittently, and none of her local engineers could identify the cause. She explained that the system had originally been installed and calibrated by a small team of human engineers nearly a decade earlier, as part of an early cooperative program between Earth and the Concorde. Those engineers had left detailed notes at the time, but the notes referenced technical standards and troubleshooting methods that none of her current staff had ever been trained to understand. I promised her that the council would send assistance as quickly as possible, though even as I said it, I felt the hollowness of the promise. We simply did not have enough qualified engineers left who understood these systems well enough to fix them quickly. The people who did understand them had already left and showed no sign of wanting to return. Back at council headquarters, tension was building in a different way. Councillor Ashen Meyer, the very official who had first accused the humans of cheating during that fateful diplomatic exercise, now found himself under intense pressure from other councillors demanding answers. I watched him stand before an emergency session, visibly uncomfortable, trying to explain that nobody could have predicted the scale of the fallout from a single downgrade in diplomatic status. A councillor from the outer trade worlds, a sharp-voiced representative named Yoren Dask, interrupted him mid-sentence. Yoren pointed out that the warning signs had been there for cycles, if anyone had bothered to look. Human ships had quietly handled the most dangerous supply routes. Human engineers had quietly solved the most difficult technical problems. Human diplomats had quietly smoothed over conflicts between rival species that otherwise might have escalated into open hostility. All of it had been treated as background noise, easily ignored, until the noise suddenly stopped. I sat through that session feeling a strange mixture of anger and helplessness. Anger at the counselors who still seemed more concerned with protecting their own reputations than solving the crisis unfolding across dozens of systems. Helplessness because I did not yet know what solution, if any, still remained available to us. By the end of the second week, the pattern had become undeniable. Every sector that had quietly depended on human presence, whether through engineering support, medical assistance, or logistical coordination, was now showing signs of serious strain. Some sectors managed to adapt quickly, pulling resources from elsewhere to patch the most urgent gaps. Others were not so fortunate. I received word that a mid-sized colony near the Threll boundary had lost power to an entire residential district after an aging generator, previously maintained by a small human contracted team, finally failed without anyone available who understood its outdated design well enough to repair it in time. Thousands of residents were relocated to emergency shelters while local engineers worked desperately, and largely unsuccessfully, to bring the system back online. I visited that colony personally, walking through crowded shelters filled with families wrapped in thin blankets, children too young to understand why their homes had suddenly gone dark and cold. A mother named Ilona Marsh approached me, her young son clinging to her side, and asked simply why this had happened. I did not have a good answer for her. I only had the truth, which felt far too small and far too late to offer any real comfort. I began to realize, standing in that shelter, that this crisis was not simply about failing machinery or missing engineers. It was about the quiet, uncomfortable truth that an entire civilization had built its comfort upon labor and expertise it had never properly respected, and now that foundation was gone, leaving behind nothing but the sound of alarms nobody had prepared to answer. As I returned to council headquarters that night, I passed through corridors filled with anxious staff, exhausted engineers, and counselors arguing loudly behind closed doors about who should be blamed for what was clearly becoming an emergency far larger than any of us had first imagined. Somewhere far beyond Concord space, on a planet that had quietly kept so much of our world running without complaint, humanity had already moved on, and I began to suspect that convincing them to look back in our direction would prove to be the hardest task any of us had ever faced. Word of the crisis did not stay contained within Concord space for long. Rivals who had watched our borders for cycles, waiting patiently for any sign of weakness, noticed the silence where human patrol ships used to fly, and they wasted no time deciding what that silence meant. I first learned about the incursions from a tense briefing led by Fleet Commander Elena Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense officer who had spent most of her career coordinating border defense alongside human fleet detachments. She stood before a star map covered in small red markers, each one representing a confirmed hostile contact along territory that had been quiet for as long as most of us could remember. Elena explained, in a voice carefully controlled to hide her frustration, that human patrol squadrons had handled roughly 70% of all border interdiction along the Threll and Vantor corridors. These were not simple routine patrols. They involved constant, active monitoring of smuggling routes, rapid response to distress calls, and quiet deterrence that discouraged raiders from even attempting incursions in the first place. She told us that within days of the human withdrawal, activity from the Skarn hegemony had spiked dramatically along the Threll corridor. Ships that had never dared approach Concord territory openly were now probing our defenses, testing response times, searching for gaps they could exploit. Without human squadrons filling those gaps, the response times had grown dangerously slow. I asked Elena what resources remained available to reinforce the border. She explained that Concord fleets, while capable, had never been designed to operate at the scale required to cover routes previously handled jointly with human forces. Ships were being pulled from less critical assignments, but the process was slow, and every day of delay gave hostile forces more confidence to push further. The first serious incident came only 5 days later, when a Skarn raiding fleet struck a mining outpost near the edge of the Threll corridor. The outpost, home to nearly 12,000 people, had relied for years on a joint patrol agreement that included regular human fleet rotations. Those rotations had ended abruptly with the withdrawal, leaving the outpost defended by a small, outdated local militia entirely unprepared for a coordinated assault. I received the emergency transmission personally, patched through directly to my office console. The voice on the other end belonged to a local administrator named Oscar Lindquist, his words fast and clipped, barely holding back panic as he described enemy ships already breaking through the outpost's outer defense perimeter. He begged for reinforcements, for anything, telling us that his people had almost no way to defend themselves against a force of that size. Fleet Commander Brooks scrambled every available ship within range, but the nearest Concorde squadron was still nearly 6 hours away. 6 hours might as well have been an eternity for a defenseless mining outpost under direct attack. I sat in the command center that night, listening to updates arrive in agonizing intervals, each one worse than the last. By the time Concorde reinforcements finally arrived, the Skarn raiders had already withdrawn, but not before causing significant damage to the outpost's primary docking structure and life support systems. Casualty reports came in slowly over the following hours, and I remember feeling a heavy, sickening weight settle in my chest with each number that appeared on my screen. I traveled to the outpost personally 3 days later, accompanying a relief convoy tasked with delivering emergency medical supplies and temporary shelter equipment. Walking through the damaged corridors, I saw firsthand the kind of destruction that a single unopposed raid could inflict upon a community that had never expected to need to defend itself. A young medic named Priya Solano, exhausted and covered in the fine gray dust that seemed to coat every surface of the damaged station, told me quietly that this outpost had never faced a serious threat in the 15 years since it was founded, precisely because everyone knew human patrols would respond quickly to any sign of trouble. She said the sense of safety here had been so complete that most residents had never even bothered to learn basic emergency procedures. I asked her what she thought should happen now. She looked at me with tired, steady eyes and said that people needed to know they would be protected, and that promises without real strength behind them meant nothing at all. Her words stayed with me long after I left the outpost, echoing through every subsequent briefing I attended. The Skarn incursion turned out to be only the beginning. Word of the successful raid spread quickly through hostile networks, and within 2 weeks, similar probing attacks began appearing along the Vantor corridor as well, this time from smaller opportunistic raiding groups eager to test whether the Concorde's weakened defenses extended beyond just the Threll region. Fleet Commander Brooks worked tirelessly during this period, reorganizing patrol routes, requesting emergency funding for new ship construction, and pushing for expedited training programs to prepare local militias for threats they had never before needed to consider. I attended every one of her briefings, watching her grow visibly more exhausted with each passing week, carrying a burden that had previously been shared across 2 entire civilizations, now resting almost entirely on Concorde's shoulders alone. During one particularly difficult session, a counselor named Farron Dale suggested reaching out to other allied species for emergency military assistance, hoping that spreading the burden might ease the strain on our own forces. Elena explained patiently that most allied species had their own defense commitments and limited surplus capacity, and that none of them possessed the kind of specialized rapid response experience that human squadrons had developed over years of joint operation with Concorde forces. I remember Farron asking, almost desperately, whether there was any way to convince the humans to reconsider, even temporarily, given the scale of the crisis now unfolding. Elena's answer was measured but firm. She reminded the room that the Council itself had voted to strip humanity of its partnership status, and that expecting an immediate return to full cooperation after such a public and deliberate insult seemed unrealistic, no matter how urgent our current situation had become. The most severe test came nearly a month after the withdrawal, when the Thessaran Combine, a long-standing rival power that had watched Concord's space carefully for cycles, launched a coordinated assault against a border world called Halvern Reach. Unlike the earlier raids, this was not a simple opportunistic strike. It was a calculated, large-scale operation involving multiple warships, clearly intended to test just how far the Concord's weakened defenses could be pushed. I was present in the command center when the first distress signals arrived from Halvern Reach. The colony's planetary defense grid, though functional, had never been designed to withstand a coordinated multi-ship assault without the support of the mobile human strike fleets that had previously deterred exactly this kind of attack. Fleet Commander Brooks moved quickly, redirecting every available ship toward Halvern Reach, but the distances involved meant that reinforcements would take nearly 10 hours to arrive. 10 hours during which the colony's defenders would be entirely on their own against a force clearly designed to overwhelm them. I listened to hours of tense communication between the colony's local defense commander, a steady-voiced officer named Marcus Ellery, and Fleet Command back at headquarters. Marcus reported wave after wave of incoming enemy fighters, his defense grid straining under the pressure, his available ships dwindling as the assault continued without pause. At one point, nearly 6 hours into the engagement, Marcus's voice came through the comm system, carrying a note of genuine fear that I had not heard from him before. He reported that a section of the planetary shield generator had taken direct damage, and that if it failed completely, the assault fleet would be able to begin bombarding the surface directly, threatening the nearly 200,000 civilians living below. I remember the silence that fell across the command center as everyone listened, helpless, unable to do anything but wait for reinforcements that still remained hours away. Fleet Commander Brooks stood rigidly at the main console, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the star map, as though sheer will alone might somehow speed up the arrival of her ships. In the end, Halvern Reach held, though barely. The shield generator survived, just enough to withstand the remaining assault, until Concord reinforcements finally arrived and forced the Thessaran fleet into a costly retreat. The victory, if it could even be called that, came at a steep price. Dozens of local defense pilots lost their lives during those 10 hours, along with significant damage to the colony's infrastructure that would take months, if not years, to fully repair. I traveled to Halvern Reach shortly after the attack, joining a delegation tasked with assessing the damage and coordinating recovery efforts. Walking through the colony's central plaza, now scarred with debris and hastily constructed emergency shelters, I met a woman named Clara Whitmore, a local schoolteacher who had spent the entire assault huddled in an underground shelter with dozens of frightened children. Clara told me, her voice steady despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face, that the children had asked her repeatedly during the attack why the ships that always used to protect them had not come. She admitted she had not known how to answer them then, and still did not know how to answer them now. I had no better answer to offer her than I had offered Ilona Marsh weeks earlier in that cold, powerless shelter. Back at council headquarters, the mood had shifted from denial to something closer to genuine alarm. Counselors who had once dismissed concerns about the human withdrawal as exaggerated now openly debated the possibility that the Concord's entire border security structure might collapse entirely if the current trend continued. Fleet Commander Brooks presented a sobering assessment during one of the following sessions. She explained that Concord forces, even with emergency reinforcements and accelerated training programs, could not realistically match the operational tempo that joint human and Concord patrols had once maintained. She warned that without some form of renewed cooperation, further incursions were not just likely, they were inevitable. I remember Counselor Joran Dask standing during that session, his earlier frustration now tempered by something closer to genuine fear. He asked the room directly whether anyone still believed the original vote against humanity had been worth the cost we were now paying. Nobody answered him. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. As I left that session, walking slowly through the dimmed corridors of council headquarters, I found myself thinking again of Grace Holloway's calm voice, the single sentence she had offered before leaving the chamber weeks earlier. "We understand, and we will act accordingly." I finally understood with painful clarity exactly how much weight had been carried quietly within those simple words, and how thoroughly we had failed to recognize it until it was almost too late to matter. The council debated for nearly a week before finally agreeing to send a formal delegation to Earth. I had not expected to be chosen as part of that delegation, but Director Alson Voro insisted that my experience coordinating the logistics crisis over the past month made me a necessary addition to the group. I remember feeling a strange mixture of dread and cautious hope as our transport ship prepared for departure. Our delegation was small, deliberately so. Alson believed that arriving with a modest group might signal genuine humility rather than the kind of grand political spectacle the council so often preferred. Councillor Joran Dask joined us as well, along with Fleet Commander Brooks, whose first-hand knowledge of the border crisis made her presence essential for any serious conversation about renewed cooperation. The journey to Earth took nearly 3 days, and I spent most of that time reviewing briefing materials, trying to anticipate every possible question we might face once we arrived. I kept returning to Grace Holloway's calm expression during that final council session, wondering what kind of reception awaited us now that the situation had grown so much more urgent. When our ship finally entered Earth's orbit, I found myself staring out the viewport at a planet that looked, at first glance, almost unremarkable. Blue oceans, scattered clouds, the soft glow of city lights visible even from orbit. It was strange to think that a world so ordinary in appearance had quietly held together so much of the Concorde's stability for years without any of us fully appreciating it. We were met at the orbital docking station by a modest reception team, polite but noticeably reserved. There were no grand greetings, no ceremonial gestures, nothing resembling the kind of formal welcome the council typically expected when arriving on official business. A young coordinator named Daniel Ashcroft guided us through customs procedures with brisk efficiency, offering little in the way of conversation beyond what was strictly necessary. I asked Daniel, as politely as I could manage, whether Ambassador Holloway would be available to meet with our delegation. He informed us, without any particular emotion in his voice, that Grace Holloway no longer held an active diplomatic position, having stepped back from Concorde relations shortly after the withdrawal was finalized. He explained that our meeting had instead been scheduled with a mid-level trade coordinator, a clear signal about how seriously Earth currently regarded our visit. I remember the quiet sting of that realization settling over our delegation as we made our way through the surface shuttle toward the meeting location. We had come expecting, perhaps naively, that the scale of the crisis back home might warrant a serious, high-level conversation. Instead, we were being handled with the same polite efficiency one might offer any minor administrative matter. Our meeting took place in a modest government building, functional rather than impressive, nothing like the grand chambers we were accustomed to back at council headquarters. The trade coordinator, a calm woman named Laura Whitfield, greeted us with professional courtesy but little warmth. She listened patiently as Councillor Joran Dask outlined the council's proposal, an offer to reinstate humanity's full partnership status immediately, along with a formal public apology for the earlier vote. Laura took notes throughout the presentation, nodding occasionally, but her expression remained carefully neutral. When Joran finished, she thanked him for the proposal and explained that she would forward our request to the appropriate review committee, though she offered no indication of how long that review might take or what outcome we should expect. Fleet Commander Brooks, clearly frustrated by the lack of urgency in the room, spoke up directly, describing the recent attack on Halvern Reach in stark detail, emphasizing the civilian casualties and the ongoing risk to dozens of other border colonies without adequate defense coverage. She asked plainly whether Earth intended to resume its patrol commitments, even on a limited basis, while the broader partnership discussions continued. Laura listened carefully, and for the first time during the meeting, her expression shifted into something closer to genuine consideration. She explained that Earth's government had indeed been monitoring reports from Concord space, and that the situation at Halvern Reach had been discussed internally. However, she made clear that any resumption of cooperation would require formal agreements guaranteeing that humanity would never again be treated as a convenient, disposable resource whenever the Council found it politically expedient. I found myself speaking up at that point, perhaps more directly than protocol usually allowed. I told Laura honestly that the crisis we were facing had forced many of us to recognize, painfully and belatedly, just how much of the Concord's stability had depended on quiet human contributions that had never been properly acknowledged or valued. I admitted that this recognition had come far too late to prevent significant harm, but that it was, at the very least, sincere. Laura studied me for a long moment before responding. She said that sincerity, while appreciated, could not undo the pattern of behavior that had led to this situation in the first place. She reminded us that humanity had spent years quietly supporting Concord infrastructure, absorbing insults and dismissive treatment along the way, without ever receiving the recognition or respect that their contributions had clearly earned. After the formal meeting concluded, Daniel Ashcroft offered to give our delegation a brief tour of a nearby shipyard before our return journey, an unexpected gesture that Alson accepted gratefully. I think, in hindsight, that Daniel wanted us to see something firsthand that no report or briefing could fully capture. The shipyard itself stretched across a wide coastal facility, rows of vessels in various stages of construction, workers moving efficiently between projects with a kind of quiet, practiced competence. Daniel explained that the facility was currently operating at roughly half its normal capacity, a deliberate decision made after the withdrawal, as demand for Concord contracts had understandably dropped following the diplomatic break. I asked him whether the workers here felt any resentment toward the Concord for what had happened. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. He said that most people did not feel anger exactly. They simply felt that Earth had spent enough years proving its value to people who refused to see it, and that continuing to offer that value without proper respect no longer made sense to them. We passed a group of engineers working on a mid-sized transport vessel, their conversation light and easy despite the physical demands of their work. One of them, a woman named Sophie Marlowe, noticed our delegation and offered a polite nod before returning her attention to the task in front of her. There was no hostility in her expression, only a kind of calm indifference that somehow felt more unsettling than open anger would have. Daniel led us toward the edge of the shipyard, where we could see a row of docked vessels bearing the insignia of the Joint Patrol Program that had once operated along the Threll and Vantor corridors. He explained that these ships remained fully operational, fueled and ready, but simply had not been authorized for redeployment since the withdrawal took effect. I stood there for a long moment, looking at those idle ships, thinking of Fleet Commander Brooks's exhausted reports, of Marcus Ellery's 10-hour ordeal above Halvern Reach, of the countless colonists who had spent recent weeks living in fear without the protection they had once taken for granted. It was a strange, painful thing to witness capabilities sitting quietly unused, simply because trust had been broken so thoroughly that nobody yet knew how to properly rebuild it. Before we departed, Daniel arranged one final, unscheduled meeting, one that surprised our entire delegation. Grace Holloway herself agreed to speak with us briefly, though she made clear through Daniel that this was a personal courtesy rather than any official diplomatic gesture. We met her in a quiet, unremarkable office near the edge of the shipyard complex. She looked much the same as she had during that final council session, calm, composed, entirely unreadable in the way that had unsettled so many counselors during her time as ambassador. Counselor Joran Dask began by offering a formal apology on behalf of the council, expressing genuine regret over the vote that had led to this crisis. Grace listened politely, her expression unchanged throughout his lengthy statement. When he finished, she thanked him quietly for his words, but made clear that words alone would not be enough to repair what had been broken. I asked her directly what it would take to rebuild the kind of trust that had once existed between our peoples. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and her response has stayed with me ever since. She said that trust could not be demanded back the moment it became inconvenient to live without it. She said that Earth had spent years quietly proving its worth, absorbing dismissal and disrespect without complaint, and that any future cooperation would need to be built on genuine, consistent respect rather than crisis-driven necessity. She added one final thought before our meeting concluded, delivered in the same calm, measured tone she had used during that fateful council session weeks earlier. She said that Earth had not left to punish the Concord, despite how it may have appeared. They had left simply because the council had asked them to, clearly and deliberately, through the outcome of that vote, and Earth had chosen to respect that decision fully, rather than continue offering support to people who had made their true feelings so plainly known. As our delegation prepared to board our transport ship for the return journey, I found myself looking back one final time at the quiet shipyard, at the idle patrol ships, at the calm, competent people who had built so much of what the Concord had come to depend upon, without ever asking for the recognition they so clearly deserved. I understood, with a clarity that felt both painful and long overdue, that rebuilding this relationship would require far more than a single apology or a hastily drafted proposal. It would require years of consistent, genuine effort, and there was no guarantee that Earth would ever choose to extend that trust to us again. 6 months passed before the Concord truly began to understand the shape of the world it now had to live in. I spent those months moving between crisis briefings, recovery reports, and long, exhausting sessions where counselors argued endlessly about policies that should have been considered years earlier, back when there was still time to prevent any of this from happening. The border situation stabilized, though not in the way any of us had hoped. Fleet Commander Brooks managed to reorganize Concord defenses into a leaner, more disciplined structure, one that could at least respond to threats within a reasonable time frame, even if it lacked the seamless efficiency that joint human cooperation had once provided. Colonies along the Threll and Vantor corridors learned, slowly and painfully, to take their own defense more seriously, training local militias and investing in equipment that should have been prioritized long before the crisis forced their hand. The infrastructure crisis proved harder to fully resolve. Some systems were eventually repaired through painstaking trial and error, as engineers slowly rebuilt the knowledge that had once existed quietly in the minds of departed human technicians. Other systems were simply replaced entirely, at enormous cost, with newer designs that did not require the specialized expertise the Concord no longer had reliable access to. I visited Faro Relay again during this period, curious to see how the station had fared in the months since my first visit. Callum Reeve greeted me at the docking bay, looking considerably less exhausted than before, though the weariness in his eyes suggested the recovery had come at a steep personal cost. He showed me the newly rebuilt coolant systems, explaining that his team had finally managed to stabilize operations, though it had taken nearly 4 months of careful, deliberate work to reach that point. He told me something during that visit that stayed with me long afterward. He said that the experience had taught his entire staff an uncomfortable lesson about how much they had once taken for granted, and how easily comfort could blind an organization to the true value of the people quietly holding it together. I found myself nodding along, recognizing the same painful lesson reflected in nearly every corner of Concord space during those difficult months. The political fallout within the council itself proved just as significant as the practical challenges we faced. Councillor Ashen Meyer, whose accusation during that fateful diplomatic exercise had helped trigger the original vote, resigned from his position under mounting pressure from constituents who no longer trusted his judgment. His departure did little to solve the underlying problems, but it did signal a shift in how seriously the council now approached decisions involving human relations. Councillor Joran Dask, who had grown increasingly vocal throughout the crisis, was elected to a newly created oversight position specifically focused on maintaining respectful, transparent relationships with allied species, including any future negotiations with Earth. I attended several of his early sessions, impressed by how genuinely he seemed to have absorbed the lessons of the past months, rather than simply performing concern for political benefit. Small, careful steps toward renewed cooperation began emerging gradually. Trade agreements, modest at first, were re-established between individual colonies and private human companies willing to engage despite the broader diplomatic freeze still technically in place between Earth's government and the Concord Council. These agreements lacked the scale of the old partnership, but they represented something important nonetheless, a willingness on both sides to rebuild trust slowly, through consistent, honest effort rather than grand political gestures. I found myself corresponding occasionally with Laura Whitfield, the trade coordinator who had met with our delegation during that difficult visit to Earth. Our exchanges remained professional, careful, focused mainly on coordinating the small trade agreements that had begun taking shape. But over time, I noticed a subtle shift in her tone, a cautious openness that suggested genuine progress was possible, even if it would take considerably longer than any of us initially hoped. During one of our exchanges, Laura mentioned that public opinion on Earth remained deeply divided regarding any future relationship with the Concord. Many people felt that Earth had finally received the respect it deserved by demonstrating its own worth so clearly, and worried that renewed cooperation might simply invite a return to the old pattern of quiet exploitation. Others believed that isolation served no one well in the long run, and that a carefully rebuilt partnership, based on genuine mutual respect, remained worth pursuing. I understood both perspectives completely, having witnessed firsthand the painful consequences of taking a vital partner for granted. I could not blame anyone on Earth for their hesitation, especially knowing how thoroughly the Council had failed to recognize their value until crisis forced the issue upon us. Nearly 8 months after the initial withdrawal, I found myself once again standing on the observation deck of Halvorn Station, the same location where I had first watched human ships depart without warning so many months earlier. The station had changed considerably since then, its systems stabilized through months of careful, deliberate reconstruction, its staff considerably more attentive to the kind of quiet infrastructure work that had once been so easily overlooked. Director Alson Voro joined me on the observation deck that evening, both of us watching the steady traffic of Concord vessels moving through the station's docking bays. He mentioned, almost casually, that recovery efforts across the sector had finally stabilized to the point where routine operations no longer required constant emergency oversight. It was, in its own way, a significant milestone, though one that felt hollow given everything it had cost to reach. I asked him whether he thought full cooperation with Earth would ever truly be restored. He considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly that he did not know. He said that trust, once broken so publicly and so thoroughly, rarely returned to its original form, no matter how much effort both sides invested in rebuilding it. At best, he suggested, we might eventually build something new, something more balanced and honest than what had existed before, built on genuine respect rather than quiet, unacknowledged dependence. I found some comfort in that thought, even if it offered no easy resolution to the uncertainty still surrounding our future relationship with Earth. Perhaps, I considered, the old partnership had never truly been healthy to begin with, built as it was on an imbalance that the Council had conveniently chosen not to examine too closely for far too long. As Alson and I continued our quiet conversation, a notification appeared on the station's main sensor display, drawing the attention of nearby staff. A single unidentified vessel had entered the outer edge of Concord space, its configuration immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent recent months studying every detail of human ship design out of sheer necessity. The ship made no aggressive movements, offered no communication, and simply held position at the very edge of our sensor range, as though observing quietly from a careful distance. Alson and I exchanged a glance, both of us clearly uncertain what this unexpected appearance might mean. I ordered station personnel to attempt contact, though I suspected, based on everything I had learned over the past months, that any response would come only if and when Earth decided it was appropriate to offer one. The attempt went unanswered, the ship simply remaining exactly where it was, its presence quiet but undeniable. I stood there for a long while, watching that distant, silent vessel on the display, feeling a complicated mixture of hope and uncertainty settle over me. Perhaps this was simply routine observation, Earth quietly monitoring the situation from a cautious distance to assess whether the Concorde had genuinely learned anything meaningful from the painful lessons of the past months. Perhaps it represented something more, a tentative first step toward eventual reconciliation, offered carefully and without commitment, the way one might test the strength of a bridge before deciding whether it was safe enough to cross. Alson asked quietly what I thought we should do next. I told him honestly that I did not know, but that perhaps, for once, the right answer was not to demand an explanation or force an immediate resolution. Perhaps the right answer was simply to wait, patiently and respectfully, allowing Earth to decide in its own time whether the Concorde had truly earned back even the smallest measure of the trust we had so carelessly discarded. As the evening wore on, the unidentified vessel remained exactly where it was, neither approaching nor retreating, simply present, simply watching. I found myself thinking back to Grace Holloway's calm, steady voice during that final conversation on Earth, her quiet insistence that trust could not be demanded back the moment it became convenient to need it again. I did not know, standing there on that observation deck, whether the distant ship represented the beginning of something new, or simply a careful reminder that Earth remained watchful, cautious, and in no particular hurry to forgive a mistake that had cost so many people so much. What I did know, with a certainty that had settled deep within me over the past 8 difficult months, was that the Concorde would never again make the mistake of taking quiet, essential contributions for granted, regardless of how this particular story eventually concluded. The ship remained on our sensors through the night, a silent, steady presence at the edge of everything we had once assumed was ours to command without question. I left the observation deck eventually, exhausted but strangely hopeful, carrying with me the understanding that whatever came next, whether reconciliation or continued distance, the Concorde had finally learned to see clearly the value of those it had once so carelessly dismissed, even if that lesson had arrived far later and at a far steeper cost than any of us would have wished.